comport myself this way now for Zoom. Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Thanks, Jade. Let me also just thank the organizers of this conference for putting on such a great event and for inviting me to be a part. Je suis heureux d'essayer de répondre à vos questions en français. Et je vous remercie en avance pour votre patience avec mon français que je caractérise très enthousiasme, mais un peu imprécis. Okay, so my talk today revives a project that, like lots of projects, slowed down during the pandemic, and it is part of a joint effort that I'm also working on, also slowly, with Peter Szczepanik at Charles University in Prague. And this comes from our shared interest in trying to develop an analytical language for understanding the circulation of audiovisual content in the streaming age. In my effort this morning, I wish to use three marginal Canadian television shows operating in the shadows of three different streaming platforms. The free ad-supported service known as Pluto TV, the throwback section of the Canadian private broadcaster CTV's various web presences, and Hoopla, a US-based streaming service made available to people holding membership cards at their local public libraries as lenses through which we might start to meditate on the possible benefits that would come from that effort. Ideally, this is something that we might discuss during the Q&A period that follows. I'm inspired by recent work on questions of distribution that invite a consideration of the material conditions that allow a film or television series or documentary to move from place to place, from MacDonald O'Donoghue and Haven's digital media distribution to more specific projects like the international circulation of Italian cinema that comes from Milan and Bologna and Lugano. I'm also inspired by some previous work on the cultural economy of reruns and syndicated television, such as that undertaken by Derek Compere, or in a recently published article by Ann Gilbert, which charts the changing value of rerun television programs in the United States from television's inception to our current situation. Recent work studying the characteristics of catalogs, Amanda's being one of them, is also important in this regard. I believe that work would benefit from a more expansive theoretical consideration of what we mean by the concept of circulation and a greater appreciation of mobility in non-US contexts. In short, I think we are missing out on the benefits that a more robust theorization that would come from blending approaches that see distribution in more media industrial terms, like intellectual property, and now, of course, of algorithmic sorting, or of catalogs and of borders, with work drawn from cultural studies and anthropology that is more attentive to the ways that would be more attentive to the ways audiovisual content is reorganized, repackaged, and given new forms of value within different cultural and media-related contexts. So this quote here from Benjamin Lee and Edward Lee Puma is representative of a small body of work in anthropology dealing with questions of circulation. Work by Will Straw, there's your Montreal content, and by Benjamin Wu point to the idea that circulation can help us appreciate how forms of culture shape our experiences of time, space, and social connection. So the move that I'm proposing to make pivots away from a concern with geography and towards an analytical language associated with temporality and with valuation. And that move redirects attention to the various formal and informal intermediaries that influence the traffic of cultural commodities, even in a virtual sense, and invites a language that emphasizes notions such as velocity, speeding up and slowing down, and obstacles into a discussion about cultural movement. Finally, this effort departs by thinking about the movements or flows of media text less in global or transnational terms and more through an appreciation of how such texts travel within specific media markets. If we wish to extend the clumsy traffic metaphor that I've been deploying here, then this effort is interested in what Elizabeth Povinelli characterizes as the routes by which culture travels as much as it is interested in the destinations and the way the character of that cultural text changes as it travels through space and time. To undertake this work in this context, in the context in which this conference is taking place, is to think more seriously about the impact of Nieborg and Poel's concept of platformization along temporal lines, to ask questions about the life cycles of different media forms, and to ask what happens when television series leave major platforms, like Netflix or Crave, for example, and to appreciate what takes place on the margins of catalogs of different media platforms as a way to bring these things together. The recent announcement by both Disney and Netflix regarding what Disney CEO Bob Iger calls content impairment, which it's really just content cuts and then the write-downs that come from it, raises even more questions about the afterlives of online content. But it is also true that when we consider the various steps along the way of what we would call the life cycle of a film or television program serves as a kind of circulatory commodity. We know the hard versions of these commodities move through primary and secondary channels known as windows, from an in-theater release, say, to a movie, to a television rebroadcast, to their appearances on in-flight entertainment packages, and then at hotels. We also know about the transformations of films and television series into material forms, such as DVDs, which appeared first as new offerings, then as occupants in the bargain bin, now reappearing in garage sales and used bookstores, with prices and value changing every step along the way. Thanks to the work of people like Ramon Lobato, and recently as evidenced in Blake Atwood's study of the circulation of home video in Iran, and in Jade Miller's recent methodological reflections on research undertaken in Nigeria, we have gained an appreciation of the role of shadow or informal economies in challenging universalized accounts of global flows and as a means of reading back against dominant or hegemonic business practices, or political or policing systems and legal infrastructures that may inhibit flows of culture. However, we lack much in the way of appreciating the multiple sites in which digital texts appear online, and we remain largely in the dark about how a television series moves across platforms, sites, and online viewing windows, and how that's related to the changing sense in which that text's value also undergoes transformation as it undertakes that movement, first to a premium streaming window, then from platform to platform. We also lack a vocabulary for characterizing the ones that eventually fall out of rotation. Where are the bargain and trash bins for the films, television shows, comedy specials, music concerts, and food shows that sit at the edges of catalogs before they fall away? How do platforms act as staging grounds for studying the overlapping circulatory regimes that move culture not only from place to place, but from within places? So these questions are relevant for considering the status of a troubled cultural commodity such as the English-Canadian television program. Because here we have a product that has been freighted by an incredible presence of government programs and policy instruments, whether through funding agencies operating at the federal or provincial level supporting its production, to content quotas, to rules regarding co-productions, to discourses which have marginalized the Canadian television programming as somehow secondary, particularly in English, to better television coming from south of the border. Such features, both material and discursive, have played a role in determining the routes by which the Canadian television show travels, and they have been instrumental in dictating the often relatively short life cycle of so much particularly English Canadian television. As we know, few shows achieve long enough life to achieve syndication status, and measures of success or failure are measured up against American programs for which it must compete. If one of the arguments of Nieborg and Poel's argument is the platforms make cultural commodities contingent, then it is not unreasonable to say that the same word has long been applicable to the English-Canadian television show. That contingency makes a consideration of how such programming circulates on different platforms such a worthy endeavor, and it's a reminder of the presence of scarcity in media environments typically characterized, mistakenly, in my view, by abundance. The Littlest Hobo is a story about a German shepherd that travels from town to town, helping people in need, staying around just long enough to assist the human heroes in the story before moving on to the next town. The story began as a film released in 1959 and was directed by Charles Rondeau, who would go on to direct several other television series during the 1960s, including Man from U.N.C.L.E., Mission Impossible, and The Odd Couple. And then The Littlest Hobo was then turned into a syndicated series that aired in several different countries around the world through the mid-1960s. In 1979, Canada's private broadcaster, the CTV, revived the show, and it ran for 6 seasons. This is clip from the first day of its broadcast. The show's format followed that of other non-continuous narrative programs, allowing for guest appearances from a range of different Canadian acting talent, including this, an early appearance by a young Mike Myers, pictured here in episode 10 of season 1. After the series wrapped in 1985, reruns appeared on other CTV channels during the 2000s as CTV bought up other media properties, most notably including the newspaper, the Globe and Mail, before it appeared again online as part of a joint initiative between Google Canada and the Canadian Media Fund, which is the fund that supports the production of television, to restore old television series and circulate them on YouTube for free on a channel called Encore Plus, that launched in 2017 and ran until 2022. From there, Hobo episodes can now be seen on several different back on several different cable television shows owned by CTV's parent company, Bell Media, including Animal Planet. But now it airs on CTV's free app or on its website in its throwback section, where it highlights a bunch of old television shows that it holds. So with this brief biography, we can see how The Littlest Hobo's route through traffic tells us much about its commodity status. In Canada, it begins as a previously successful product that is revived and produced by CTV's production arm to satisfy Canadian content quotas, and as part of a scheduling mix that is very familiar to Canadians watching television for much of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, in which the Canadian stuff would be rolled in alongside the American programming, whereby the Canadian broadcasters would lift out the American ads and sub in the Canadian ones. It also stands, Littlest Hobo also stands as a low-cost investment in intellectual property because the rotating talent runs from episode to episode. It then reappears on second channels owned by CTV during a period of corporate expansion with the absence of content, so they need old stuff to fill these stations. And it would end up in the form that we know as Bell Media as a way to fulfill an absence of content. In its encore form, it then reappears through a logic of heritage and preservation and prized evidence of the value of Canada's policy apparatus. In its return to CTV, this time in throwback, imbues The Littlest Hobo with a retro character and places it amongst a range of different programs that lie toward the back of Bell Media's rights holdings, most notably 2 shows that appear on the same night as The Littlest Hobo opened, Barney Miller and Benson. At the same time, though, Littlest Hobos continue to circulate freely online, including on YouTube, raising questions about whether CTV has estimated that the show's commercial value is not worth the legal costs involved in chasing after those who continue to post it online. For the second case, they get a little shorter here. We turn to Edgemont, which is a drama that focused on the trials and tribulations of a group of teen protagonists at a fictional Vancouver high school that was originally shot at the CBC studios in downtown Vancouver and which aired on the public broadcaster between 2000 and 2004. The show then cycled in syndication on several U.S. secondary networks, including Fox Family and Teen Nick, before ending up, like Littlest Hobo, on Encore Plus on YouTube. At present, episodes of Edgemont can now be found in the truly Canadian channel on the free advertiser-supported television service, Pluto TV, which is a partnership between Paramount and the Chorus Entertainment Group in Canada, which is the company that owns Global TV and several other specialty networks. But it also appears, that's Pluto, but it also appears on Tubi, another free service, owned, I believe, still by Fox, but somebody correct me if I'm wrong. So in Edgemont, we see several logics at play. At once, an attempt by the CBC to reproduce the successes enjoyed by earlier teen drama, Degrassi, and to pivot that program into prime time, a Canadian teen drama running alongside shows like Dawson's Creek that were in circulation on the US channels that competed for attention. Then, following a point that Ann Gilbert has made, we see the revaluation of the show as desirable content for fledgling new secondary cable channels that marks the expansion of cable before its eventual decline and absorption into catalog logics that we find on streaming platforms. On Pluto, we see the collision of back catalogs of legacy Canadian broadcasters who negotiated digital rights alongside conventional broadcasting rights, and the repositioning of that content in the form of a previously what was once now, or what was seen as an outdated mode of distribution, the channel, in the name of producing visual experiences based on drop-in or ambient viewing presented via a cascading flow of episodes following one after the other. So there's a Family Ties channel that just has episode after episode of Family Ties, or a Hell's Kitchen channel that just has one episode after the other. For this to function on the truly Canadian channel, there must be enough episodes of a form of television that has been characterized by limited supply, industrially produced Canadian television programs, and so they rely on the most consistent producer of that content, Canada's public broadcaster, the CBC, and so Edgemont appears alongside other CBC shows that were around long enough to syndicate, such as Little Mosque on the Prairie and Arctic Air. In Edgemont, we see the possible benefits of seeing fast services as bargain bins for old texts and as vital nodes in the circuits of cultural objects sitting along the sides of media catalogs and as placeholders that sit on the edges of moments of media expansion and transition. Okay, I'm getting my last example. A final example, even briefer. This article, which you see all the time, is part of a genre of articles that tells people what shows are leaving a vital intermediary service. And one of those, with the arrow in blue, points to 19-2, a police procedural focused on the lives of Montreal police officers, as one of a list of titles leaving the service known as Crave. The show first aired on the French language service of Canada's public broadcaster, Radio Canada, in 2011. It was adapted into an English language version to air on a specialty channel in 2014, and then on the main private television channel, CTV, in 2017. The series was then available on the streaming service of Radio Canada. DVD copies of all 3 seasons became available to purchase. But now it appears on, or last time I checked, which was, I have to confess, a little while ago, now it appears on Hoopla, a service based out of the United States that provides streaming video, audiobooks, ebooks, comics, movies, television, magazine, and music to anyone holding a membership card at a public library. In this, 19.2 draws us into a discussion, of course, about the dynamics of Quebecois television production, of the relationships between the English and French services of the public broadcaster, on the work of translation and adaptation, the short-term history of DVD distribution, and now the position played by library as sites for the late-stage circulation of commodity forms. So these brief examples ask us to appreciate how different forms of movement through the different pathways of circulation result in processes of repackaging and reorganizing, and of reinvesting different texts within systems of meaning. This is, of course, a story of intellectual property and of the business or institutional objectives of the different sites in which they circulate. But these examples also sit somewhere beyond just the exercise of corporate power and towards an attention to the different forces that either speed up or slow down the movement of those texts to bring them back into circulation. If circulation itself constructs and redefines the economic and cultural value of a digital object while it moves through the multi-layered, nonlinear trajectories of formal and informal online streaming markets, increasingly dominated by a global platform logic, we need to newly conceptualize agents, social actions, and spatio-temporal arrangements as a result. Studying circulation from a temporal perspective offers some potential to better appreciate the social and cultural workings of online distribution, and it brings distribution studies closer to the theoretical debates about the social construction of markets, valuation, and cultural intermediaries. So I conclude here asking whether terms like the long tail or distribution windows are sufficient to account for the life cycle of a television show or film. What would ideas of fast and slow do to how we understand the temporalities of circulation within markets? Do the routes taken by some audiovisual texts open pathways that others will follow? What are the value-creating effects of aggregating or segmenting or recommending or bundling or unbundling other operations of online circulation? By asking these questions, a more subtle language of circulation ensembles and circulation cultures would emerge, opening up productive ground for detailed reflection about how culture moves in today's platform age. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much. Open the floor for questions. Start on the right here.
Hey.
I was wondering if you could speak to, in that framework, where you see
Yeah.
Like both in terms of like torrenting, but also illegal streaming but ad-supported streaming websites, or things like mega download where people are sharing files. I mean, because I was thinking about when the posts go up saying what's leaving Netflix, that's often a cue for people to download everything as quick as they can.
Right.
So that they can
Right.
share it so that it will be available either on YouTube and these other places, and how that impacts the sort of visualization or
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I love this point. Okay, well, yeah, so I mean, I'll kind of move up to it. So, I mean, I think one of the interesting things about the research on informal economies, of course, is that informal economies are all about all about repackaging and revaluing, right? Like it's all about collecting, organizing, and then revaluing, and then sending out through alternative networks. And so in some senses, informal economies, I think, studies of informal economy already have certain kinds of the considerations about circulation kind of baked in, if you will, to the kind of discussion that I'm making here. But to the specific example that you're talking to here, where it's like they announce that something's going off of Netflix and then people start. I mean, to me, that would be an example of a kind of practice that emerges, which then changes the value of that text, which is like, you better get it now or else, right? Or else you'll lose it. And then, of course, if there are sites then where that material, which was once in one place, is now something else, then that, of course, then of course it's repackaged now as something. Now it's repackaged something different. So its meaning as a text is different. And then, of course, we can think of it in, if you want to think of it in speed terms, right? Then, of course, we could say that there might be a lag period, which is the amount of time for people to go and download it, and then there may be a period before they figure out how to set up whatever the infrastructure is to do it, and then it may speed up again if it becomes timely or something like that. I think one of the things that's interesting, your question is making me think of something else. One of the things that's interesting about Tubi, for example, is the way in which they use the platform kind of seasonally. So they'll say like, oh, like somebody died, here's a document, like here's a kind of not so great, shoddy documentary that you might be interested in here. Like you would like, oh, it's Halloween, like here's a whole bunch of programs with Elvira that you might be interested in watching, right? And so there is a kind of platform logic that is part of the way that then material that might have been relegated to the back of the catalogs or taken off, then the seasonality of it or the topicality of it, right, then stimulates the idea that now it should come back and then it will be put back on. So I think your comment, your question made me think of that kind of responsiveness to outside phenomena, right, which we sometimes talk about as being a feature of informal economies, is in fact, I think, an interesting feature of other kinds of legitimate legal platforms, right? Because it's about a skillful deployment of back catalog in search of scraping potential economic benefits that would come. Sorry, it's not the answer. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for the talk, and I'm so interested because partly I've just been following the Variety, especially, which is really excited about FAST as like the new frontier of
Right.
Television valuation and like hyping everything's going to be fast in the future. Like Netflix will be fast. Or
Yeah.
that kind of,
Yeah.
But I like and sort of without getting like too much into that hype, I also appreciated your kind of push back against just an economic logic of
Yeah.
circulation and how to think about the cultural attachment. But I have a question that maybe like invites you to talk a little bit more about velocity or like how things become revalued, or just the more specific thing about hardware. Like when I was looking into FAST, that hardware makers like Samsung, I guess Google, thinking about UK's presentation.
Yeah.
There are these hardware makers that are getting into FAST services partly to produce smartphones could already come with like some of these services. Like the ones that you talked about are mostly owned by media companies, but some are owned by hardware companies.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the question.
Yeah.
Sorry,
No. I mean,
there's
so,
a kind of hardware distribution and a kind of bundling of the service with hardware.
yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So, I mean, when you were talking, I was thinking about like when Netflix first came to Canada, I had all these students who were like incredibly into into Faulty Towers. That's what it was. Into the TV show Faulty Towers, because that was the only thing that was like among the first content that was put up on Netflix in Canada. So you had all these all these undergraduate university students making John Cleese jokes, and I thought it was hilarious, of course, because of course the novelty that's just they would watch whatever because it was on and it was new and of course like a group of people that wouldn't otherwise see this show sees it, and then it has a kind of moment, and then. But I think I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting about FAST, actually, less so its economics, of course, is that you could look at this. I mean, you could look at the content that's on FAST services now. So on Pluto is hilarious. Like, I mean, if you go to Pluto, you're probably all watching it now because it just plays as soon as you go on there. I mean, it's hilarious, right? It's a bunch of old television shows. It's like a bunch of like, a movie of like old movie networks playing old movies that were sold to television. And in a way, what we could say is that what's sitting there now is a placeholder, right? Which is, it's like cheap content that you put on the thing and you kind of just see, right? And like, Pluto, in the case of the Pluto TV in Canada, of course, like they have to say, well, we're putting some sort of Canadian stuff on there, so like, but we don't really know yet. So like, here's some stuff, and we'll put it on this channel. We'll call it Truly Canadian, and we'll put stuff up when we feel like it, basically. So I mean, in some ways, I think what you could say is, or a question, which is, is that what happens when those services get built into the hardware offerings, which is, it's not really about the content, right? It's about the potential of a viewing experience for which for which they don't really know yet. So they don't know how many people are going to do it. They don't know how people are going to respond to it. They don't know, they don't really know what advertisers think of it yet. And so they're just like, well, here's kind of like a soft launch, and we'll do it with content that's relatively inexpensive, right? And again, like I think one of the great thing about the Ann Gilbert article is the way she kind of tracks out, like, at each stage of media expansion, like reruns get revalued, right? I just think this is a brilliant way of thinking about this. So I'm just doing the same thing here, right? Which is to say that it might be productive to think about periods, like, okay, the hardware period, the content on there is the placeholder before we really figure out what it's going to be. I don't know if that's really the answer, but I think, I just couldn't help but feel this way when I was looking at Pluto, because I show it to my students and they're like, like it's not speaking to them, right? Like that's not the content that they want, okay? And then it's like, well, who is this for exactly, okay? Like who actually is watching this? Then I have some people I know who are like, it just plays in the background. It's just ambient. It's ambient Family Ties, right? But again, like that's not a business. It's not a sustainable business model. So you can make the argument that it's not about that. They need some way to try and figure out, and they'd rather be first. So go in, put some stuff on there, and to do that, in order to be able to do that, they have to recirculate the stuff that's cheap at the back of the catalog, and then maybe, maybe. Okay, something takes off and they'll get some value of it, but because they've already paid for it and they already have the rights, it's so cheap. It's not really. That's sort of what I was thinking. Yeah, it's kind of it is super interesting if you think of it that way.
We have time for one more question. Amanda.
Somewhat equally forcing you to speculate. But given your expertise, one of the things I've been curious about is an opportunity for cultural policy based on circulation.
Yep.
So, historically we've got these industries that put money into production, and we now have Tubi and Pluto aside. It's just tons of hours of Australian, Canadian, whatever production that's just inaccessible.
Right.
Any thoughts? Is there an opportunity for circulation cultural policy that actually makes an archive that's available?
Yeah, I think I know there are some people here who also studied this stuff. I mean, remember, this is a country that doesn't have an audio visual art museum, right? So like, we would go to, the Netherlands and just, or for France, and just cry on the stairs. Well, the default, unfortunately, the default position has always been that that's kind of what the CBC is supposed to do, okay? But the problem, of course, is that there's an elaborate private apparatus, there's an elaborate system of independent production. And again, we don't have to go down this road, but I said this to you earlier, which is that content regulations were intended to stimulate independent production. That's why it was there. And so but it was also intended to set up what policymakers at the time called a system, like literally an ecosystem in which broadcasters would contribute to subsidies that would help to support the programs that then they would broadcast, and then it was but a big part of that was that there was no incentive for them to invest in them further. So it would be like, okay, we're investing in Canadian content, we don't really want it. Here it is, it's at, we're gonna air it at 10:30 on, Wednesday PM, and then the show will have its requisite seasons, and then it will go away. And then we'll start again, because there's no point in paying, there's no economic value in rewarding people. Now, there are exceptions, for sure. There are definitely exceptions. I think Encore was an interesting experiment, because Encore was basically the Canadian Media Fund and a policy scared Google, excuse me, okay? Because remember, this is a period where the ambient threat that the government was going to do something. And actually it was before the language of discoverability, which is what policymakers are now talking about, and it's in the EU too. But Encore was an interesting thing because for that all to work, for them to get all of that content and to remake, to refurbish it and to put it up, they needed the cooperation of all of these different rights holders, and they got it. And if we wanted to, you could say, well, sure, why not? The content is of low, is of such low. It's not like there's incredible demand for it, so the potential, but Encore at least offered the potential, okay, of an investment in circulation. Of ostensibly a policy measure by a cultural institution, the Canadian Media Fund, that had the potential to do both, right? Which is to organize an archive and distribute and freely circulate, Canadian television. And the fact that it ran for so long is kind of a miracle in some ways. And it's not clear why it stopped. At least I don't know yet.
Thank you.
Thank you.